There is a version of history where Caitlin Clark plays in Storrs, Connecticut, suits up in UConn blue, runs Geno Auriemma's system, and becomes the latest name on a dynasty's already legendary wall. That version does not exist. Not because Clark wasn't good enough, not because UConn didn't know who she was, but because one of the most celebrated recruiters in the history of college basketball looked at a generational talent and decided someone else came first. What makes this story different from every other recruiting mess is what came after: the records, the audience, the predictions, and the fact that years later, the coach who passed on her still hasn't been able to stop talking about her. Let's go back to where this actually started, because the version most people know skips the part that makes everything else make sense. Growing up, Caitlin Clark had one school in mind, not Iowa, not any of the dozens of programs that would eventually line up to chase her: Connecticut. She has said it plainly in her own words, long after the fact. She loved the Huskies. She thought they were the coolest place in the sport. She specifically wanted, to be able to say she had been recruited by them. That detail matters more than it sounds. This was not casual interest. This was not a teenager listing 5 schools she would be equally happy at. This was a kid who had one dream program, and that dream program happened to be the most decorated dynasty in women's college basketball history. She wanted the call. She waited for the call. The call never came. Not to her, not to her family. What did happen was this: Auriemma's staff phoned her AAU coach a handful of times, a second-hand gesture routed through an intermediary that never made it to Clark herself. For a recruit ranked 4th nationally in her graduating class, that is not an oversight. Programs do not accidentally forget to call the 4th-ranked player in the country. That is a deliberate choice, and the coach himself has never pretended otherwise. For a dynasty built on identifying talent before the rest of the world figured it out, the deliberate nature of that choice is exactly what gives it weight. Auriemma did not miss Clark because his scouts slept through her games. He saw her, he evaluated her, he decided someone else mattered more. And that decision, reasonable as it may have seemed at the time, would follow him in ways no recruiting miss in women's basketball history has followed a coach before. But what was his actual reasoning? That part of the story is worth understanding before writing it off entirely, because the basketball logic, taken on its own terms, was not insane. What came attached to it, though, was a different matter entirely. Auriemma's defense of the decision is publicly on the record, delivered in his own words, and it breaks into 2 parts. The first part is a basketball argument. The second part is where things get complicated. The basketball argument goes like this: he had already given his word to Paige Bueckers, the #1 recruit in that same class. He was not willing to split a backcourt before either player had set foot on campus. In his words, it would have been silly to promise Bueckers the ball and then go recruit a second point guard behind her. He had committed to one player. He was going to honor that commitment. On its face, that is defensible. Program building is built on trust. Auriemma's reputation with recruits depended on his word meaning something. If he promised Bueckers she was the centerpiece of the program's future, breaking that implied agreement to chase another elite guard was a legitimate risk. The recruiting class he was navigating that year was unusually stacked: Bueckers, Clark, Angel Reese, Cameron Brink, Camila Cardosa. All of them would go on to become first-round talents, national award winners, or both. Betting everything on Bueckers was not reckless. She went on to win National Player of the Year as a freshman and kept UConn in championship contention for years. On pure basketball terms, the choice held up. What did not hold up was what came attached to it. When asked about Clark's well-documented desire to attend Connecticut, her stated wish to be recruited by them, Auriemma did not offer regret. He did not acknowledge that a top recruit had wanted his program, and his program had not pursued her. He placed the responsibility squarely on a 17-year-old. If she really wanted to come, he said, she should have called him herself. Neither of them lost out, he added. She made the right decision for her. It worked out fine. Sit with that for a moment.
The coach, whose entire legacy was built on finding talent before the rest of the sport noticed it, on walking into small gyms and identifying players years ahead of every rival program, is now suggesting that the burden of recruitment was on the teenager to initiate contact. This is the man who found Diana Taurasi, Maya Moore, and Brianna Stewart before other programs finished their first phone call. The skill that built 11 championships was the ability to pursue talent relentlessly and personally. And in the recruitment that would go on to matter more than any other in the sport's modern era, he waited for the talent to come to him. The basketball logic was defensible on its own. It did not need a parting line that redirected the responsibility for Clark's absence onto Clark herself. A program choosing not to recruit a player is a program making a call about its own priorities. It is not the player's failure to initiate. The moment Auriemma framed it that way publicly, a reasonable basketball decision became something people would still be discussing years later. Clark left it there. No public rebuttal, no interview where she pushed back on his framing, no lingering complaint. She picked up her recruitment and turned it toward a program 4 hours south that had never won what Connecticut had won and had never come close to it. What she built there would eventually make the original decision impossible to set aside. Iowa was not a step down, it only looked like one from the outside. When Clark arrived in Iowa City, she was walking into a program with no recent Final Four history, no built-in national spotlight, no recruiting pipeline producing first-round talent on a regular basis. Carver Hawkeye Arena was not the building that sold out for women's basketball with any kind of consistency. The program was not on the short list of names casual fans thought of when the topic of women's college basketball came up. What Iowa had instead was something more valuable to a player of her particular kind: space. At Connecticut, Clark would have been one piece inside a system already built around a player Auriemma had just publicly committed to. The offense, the attention, the design of the program's entire structure, all of it would have been shaped around Bueckers first. That is not a criticism of what UConn offered. It is simply the reality of what it would have meant for Clark specifically. She would have been a contributor inside someone else's framework. At Iowa, she was the framework. Over 4 seasons, she turned that space into the most productive individual run women's college basketball had ever seen. The records are not marginal. She finished her career as the all-time leading scorer in NCAA Division I history. Not women's history, not Big Ten history, all of NCAA Division I history, across every division, men's or women's, across every era of the game. She broke a record that had stood since 1970, held by a player most casual fans had never heard of, because women's basketball had never had the kind of attention it would generate once Clark arrived. She won back-to-back National Player of the Year awards. She led Iowa to consecutive national championship game appearances, something the program had never done before she showed up, and something that would not have been possible without her in a way that was visible to anyone watching more than 5 minutes of basketball. But here is the number that matters most when measuring what Iowa became under her: attendance. Carver Hawkeye Arena, a building that had rarely approached sellout capacity for a women's game in its history, began selling out consistently during her final seasons. Season ticket waiting lists that had not existed before she arrived began forming. Away games at other programs' arenas, buildings that had spent years playing women's games in half-filled lower bowls, started selling out specifically because Clark was walking through the visiting tunnel that night.
None of that required UConn's infrastructure. None of it required a recruiting pipeline already in motion. None of it required a national spotlight that had been cultivated over decades. Iowa had none of those advantages waiting for her. She arrived without them, and she generated her own version of all three from nothing, using only what she produced on the court. That is a harder thing to accomplish than inheriting a dynasty already running at full speed. And it is the thing that made her impossible to fit neatly into the category of simply another great player who came up through a great program. Great programs produce great players regularly. What Clark did was make a program great that had not been great before she arrived. The clearest proof of what she had built did not come from a regular season game or an individual award ceremony. It came in April, in a game that was the best possible argument for why the recruiting decision from 4 years earlier would never fully go away. Iowa versus Connecticut, national semifinal, the Final Four. Caitlin Clark on one end of the court, Paige Bueckers on the other. The 2 point guards Auriemma had once concluded could not share a backcourt were now standing on opposite sidelines in the biggest game of the women's college basketball season. The matchup he had structured his entire recruiting logic around avoiding, one dominant guard secured specifically so the other could never compete with her inside the same program, had materialized anyway on the largest stage the sport had to offer, with a trip to the national championship game on the line. Iowa won by 2 points. It was not a blowout. It was not a statement game that turned lopsided in the second half and allowed the scoreboard to do more work than the actual basketball required. It was 2 points, decided over the course of 40 minutes between two programs and two players whose paths had diverged because of one recruiting conversation that never happened. The outcome did not prove that Clark was definitively better than Bueckers. That is not the argument the game made. Both players were legitimate. Both programs had earned their position in that semifinal. What the game did prove was something more pointed, that the backcourt conflict Auriemma said would have been silly to invite into his program resolved itself anyway, just from opposite ends of the bracket, with Clark's team winning. Every element of Auriemma's original logic had been premised on keeping that matchup from happening inside his own program. He could not keep it from happening at all. Iowa's 2 point win sent Clark to a national championship game. It eliminated Bueckers and Connecticut from the tournament, and it happened in exactly the kind of high-stakes, direct competition that Auriemma's entire recruiting rationale had been built to sidestep. The rest of the college chapter closed the way Clark's career at Iowa had always seemed to be trending, with records that did not require context or caveat, and with an audience that had grown to a scale no one inside the sport had seen coming. By the time she walked off an Iowa court for the last time, the argument about what she had or hadn't accomplished was not really an argument anymore. The professional league she was entering, though, had not yet caught up to that reality, and the voice that would make the loudest claim about what awaited her was one she had heard before. June 6, 2024, less than 2 months into Clark's professional career with the Indiana Fever, Geno Auriemma appears on The Dan Patrick Show. He was there ostensibly to talk about her transition into the WNBA. What he delivered was not a scout's measured assessment. It was sharper than that, and the word that made it detonate was one he chose deliberately. Referencing earlier comments made by Diana Taurasi, a 2-decade WNBA veteran and multiple Olympic gold medalist who had warned that no amount of college dominance fully prepares a rookie for the physicality of the professional game, Auriemma agreed with the concern and then went significantly further. He said Clark was on the wrong team with the wrong skill set to absorb what the league was about to throw at her. He said, as a rookie navigating a sport that had spent years developing defenders who knew exactly how to make gifted scorers miserable, she was in for what he called a rude awakening. Then he turned toward the people watching. The fan base following Clark's career, he said, was delusional. They had, in his framing, been set up by the media and by hype to expect something a first-year professional could not possibly deliver. The kid, he concluded, had been positioned for failure before she had even played a game.
The stated intent behind those comments, if you take them at their most charitable reading, was something like protective concern. A veteran coach warning that unrealistic expectations, not Clark herself, had painted a target she would struggle to survive. That kind of warning, stripped of the specific word he chose, has a legitimate basis. Physical adjustment from college to the professional game is real. Veterans who have spent years developing their craft are not going to soften their play because a celebrated rookie walked in. The adjustment curve is steep for everyone. But delusional is not a coaching word. It is not a word you use when you are trying to protect someone from unfair expectations. Delusional is a word you use when you want to dismiss the people holding those expectations entirely. It does not caution, it belittles. And it aimed that belittlement not at the hype machine that generated the coverage, not at the media personalities who spent months comparing Clark to legends. It aimed it at the ordinary fans who had started watching women's basketball because of what Clark had done on a college court. The timing sharpened the impact considerably. Days before Auriemma's Dan Patrick appearance, Fever Sky player Kennedy Carter had delivered a flagrant foul on Clark that was already dominating sports media. The play was flagrant, the reaction was massive, and the conversation around physicality aimed specifically at Clark was already at a fever pitch before Auriemma said a single word. His comments did not emerge into a neutral environment. They landed inside an ongoing argument about whether Clark was being targeted, with an 11-time national champion's voice now added to the pile. Fox Sports personality Nick Wright publicly called the comments badly misjudged. Commentators across national platforms pointed out that Auriemma had done the exact thing he claimed to be warning against, lowering a rookie's ceiling publicly on national radio before she had played 2 full months of professional basketball. Others made a point worth examining directly. Clark herself, in every early public comment that season, had consistently deflected the hype. She told reporters she simply wanted to play basketball and let her game speak for itself. She did not walk into Indianapolis claiming to be the sport's savior. She did not embrace the comparisons to legends that media coverage kept generating around her. The hype was not something she manufactured. It was something that formed around her because of what she had done at Iowa, amplified by coverage she had no control over. So when Auriemma used the word delusional on national radio, when he characterized the people who had shown up for her career as fundamentally confused about reality, whose expectations was he actually correcting? The fans who bought tickets? The viewers who tuned in for a weeknight game in February because she was playing? Clark herself, who had never made the claims the coverage attributed to her? She did not respond publicly. She did not need to. The scoreboard was already warming up. By the end of her first professional season, the gap between what Auriemma said in June and what Clark had actually done was not a gap that required interpretation. It was just numbers, and the numbers were on one side. WNBA Rookie of the Year. 66 of a possible 67 votes from the national panel of sports writers and broadcasters responsible for the award. That is as close to unanimous as a professional sports honor gets. One panel member voted differently. Every other credentialed observer who watched the league that season looked at what Clark had done across her rookie year and named her the best first-year player in the league without meaningful debate. She was also named to the first Team All-WNBA. That distinction is different from the Rookie of the Year in a way that matters for this particular conversation. Rookie of the Year measures a player against every other player in a first year. First Team All-WNBA measures a player against every other player at every position in the league that season. Veterans with a decade of professional seasoning, players who had spent years developing precisely the kind of physical edge Auriemma said Clark lacked the skill set to handle. 5 players make the first team. Clark was one of them in her first season. She shared that list with players who had spent their entire professional careers building the kind of credibility that list is supposed to reflect. Then there's the most valuable player voting.
She finished 4th. In a field dominated by established veterans who had logged years inside the exact league environment Auriemma characterized as too physical and too demanding for her skill set, a rookie finishing 4th in MVP voting is not a near miss.
It is a direct rebuttal in the form of peer recognition from the same voters who had watched the same games. The players and observers who know better than anyone what the league's physicality actually demands looked at what Clark produced in year one and ranked her fourth best in the entire league, not fourth among rookies, fourth overall. The individual statistics supported the honors rather than inflating them. She averaged roughly 15 points, 6.5 assists, and 5 rebounds per game across her rookie year. Those numbers would be respectable for a seasoned veteran. For a player less than a year removed from college basketball, playing at the highest level of the professional game for the first time, they represent a performance that did not suggest future potential. They confirmed present reality. And then there is what she did for the Indiana Fever as a franchise. The Fever had not made a playoff appearance in nearly a decade before Clark arrived. In her first season, they did. Their opening postseason game drew close to 2 million television viewers. Their second playoff game drew roughly 2.5 million, a cable broadcast record for the league at the time. A franchise with no recent postseason relevance, built around a rookie who had supposedly been set up for failure, was suddenly commanding a national television audience the WNBA had not pulled in years. 2.5 million viewers for a team that had not sniffed national relevance in nearly 10 years. That is not what failure looks like. That is not what a mismatch between skill set and environment produces. That is what a franchise does when the person it built around defies every public prediction made about her before the season began. Wrong team, wrong skill set, set up for failure. Run those 3 phrases against what actually happened, and the gap is not subtle. A rookie supposedly mismatched for the league's physicality finished her first professional season as one of the 5 best players in that same league, led a dormant franchise back to the playoffs, and generated television numbers the sport had not seen in years. Every specific prediction Auriemma made publicly in June was answered directly by what the scoreboard produced between June and October. Nobody who made the original prediction was asked to account for the gap, but the gap existed, and it did not shrink over time. It widened, and the coach who made the prediction kept being pulled back to it in ways that suggested the subject was not finished with him, even when he might have preferred it was. A bad prediction is forgotten quickly in sports. Analysts make them constantly. Coaches offer assessments that do not hold up. The sports media cycle moves fast enough that a missed call from June is usually buried before the playoffs arrive. What keeps a prediction alive long past its natural expiration date is either the person who made it keeps returning to it, or the player it was made about keeps proving it wrong loudly enough that the original quote resurfaces on its own. In this case, both happened simultaneously, and they kept happening for years. In the months after his Dan Patrick Show appearance, Auriemma did not let the subject rest. He returned to it unprompted across podcasts and press conferences that had no direct reason to involve Caitlin Clark. On one appearance, discussing why other WNBA players came at Clark physically during games, he offered an explanation that placed partial responsibility on Clark herself, suggesting she talked plenty of trash on the court and simply received the same energy back. On another appearance, well over a year after his original comments, he was still explaining what he had meant by the word delusional, still drawing a distinction between Clark's actual behavior and the hype that had been generated around her, still working to clarify that his concern had been aimed at the coverage, not the player. That distinction, to be fair, may even be accurate on its own terms. The media ecosystem that formed around Clark's WNBA arrival was genuinely extreme. Comparisons to figures who had spent decades building their legacies were being made before she had played a single professional game. The hype was not something Clark manufactured, but it was real, and it was not hard to understand why a veteran coach might look at it and see a recipe for a difficult public year.
But here is what the ongoing clarification required. A Hall of Fame coach, more than a year after the fact, still investing time and energy into explaining himself about a player he never recruited, whose failure he predicted on national radio, who had since earned Rookie of the Year, first Team All-WNBA, and a top 5 MVP finish in response. Every appearance where he explained the original comment was another data point in a pattern that had already made the original comment impossible to simply walk away from. Media figures picked it up. Barstool Sports founder Dave Portnoy was among those who publicly surfaced the original quotes online and placed them next to updated footage of Clark's ongoing performance. That kind of juxtaposition does not require editorial commentary. The original words and the current scoreboard do the work entirely on their own. Commentators across national platforms were replaying the June audio alongside Clark's award ceremonies, her playoff statistics, her television ratings, without needing to say much of anything about the gap in between. By the following summer, more than 2 years after the Dan Patrick appearance, Auriemma was still fielding questions about Clark's impact on the sport. He told one interviewer that what an impact she had had on the WNBA in terms of making the broader country aware of who the Indiana Fever were and what the league itself offered. He acknowledged that much of the conversation around her had been drawn along political and cultural lines rather than basketball ones. He pushed back on the idea that every foul called against her carried some larger cultural meaning. He was still explaining the landscape she had landed in, still contextualizing what her presence had done to the sport's public profile, still being asked to react to a story that had begun with a recruiting call his program never made. The fact that a coach with 11 national championships is still being pulled back to explain a comment from his first Dan Patrick Show appearance about this particular player says more about the staying power of that original moment than almost anything else in this story. It did not fade the way most sports commentary fades. It compounded. Every new Clark honor, every new television rating record, every new season in which she continued to perform at a level his predictions said she could not sustain, added another layer to a record book that was quietly and relentlessly making the same argument over and over without anyone having to repeat it. He built his entire reputation on seeing what others missed. In the one case where the world would eventually decide the evaluation mattered most, he passed, predicted failure, and then found himself unable to exit the conversation that followed. There was never a dramatic confrontation between these two figures, no press conference walkout, no viral exchange on social media, no public feud with a clean beginning and a clean resolution. Clark has never, in any public setting, gone after Auriemma directly. She did not build a narrative around being passed over. She did not walk into Iowa or into the WNBA with a chip on her shoulder that she wanted the world to see. What she did instead was quieter and, in its own way, more permanent. She went to Iowa and became the all-time leading scorer in NCAA Division I history. She led a program that had never reached consecutive national championship games to back-to-back appearances. She beat UConn in the Final Four in exactly the kind of direct competition Auriemma's recruiting logic had been constructed to prevent. She entered the WNBA and became Rookie of the Year with near-unanimous recognition. She earned a spot on the first Team All-WNBA against a field of veterans who had spent years building their professional credentials. She finished 4th in MVP voting. She drew cable television records for a franchise that had been invisible to the national audience for nearly a decade.
None of those things required a public statement. None of them required her to point back at the coach who passed on her, or the coach who said she had the wrong skill set and say anything at all. The record book made the argument continuously and without her involvement. What makes this story different from a standard narrative about a player proving doubters wrong is who the doubter was. Auriemma is not an outsider making uninformed takes from outside the sport. He is the most decorated coach in women's college basketball history. 11 national championships, 23 Final Four appearances, a career built on identifying talent before the rest of the sport caught up to it. Diana Taurasi, Maya Moore, Breanna Stewart. He found them, developed them, and turned them into the kind of players the sport still talks about. When a coach with that resume questions whether a player can handle a professional league's physicality, the concern carries weight precisely because of who is saying it. The gap between his prediction and Clark's actual rookie season was not just a sports pundit getting it wrong. It was the single voice in the sport least likely to be wrong about exactly this kind of evaluation, and the scoreboard's response was direct. And then there is the original decision, the recruiting call that never came, the program that looked at the fourth-ranked player in the country and decided she was not worth a personal conversation. The coach who later said she should have called him herself if she really wanted to be a Husky. That framing did not hold up any better than the WNBA prediction did. The player who was not worth calling became the player who rewrote the record books at a program that had none of the infrastructure Connecticut offered, generated an audience that women's college basketball had not seen in a generation, and then carried that same performance into the professional game immediately upon arrival. He built his legacy on finding talent before anyone else. In this one case, the player he decided was not worth a direct phone call became the one he could not stop being asked about. Not because of a feud, not because of a public confrontation, but because a record book kept contradicting him season after season, award after award, rating after rating, without needing any help from the player it was written about. One call his staff never made to a 17-year-old who wanted to be recruited by them. One set of predictions delivered on national radio before she had played 60 days of professional basketball, and a career that has answered both continuously and without apology, simply by continuing to happen. That is not a rivalry. That is not a grudge. That is a scoreboard that has never been reset and has never stopped running up the score. Geno Auriemma passed on Caitlin Clark. Then he told the country she was in the wrong situation with the wrong skill set. The record book had other plans. And if you're watching that unfold in real time and you still think the original call was the right one, drop your take below, because that is a conversation worth having. Like this video if Clark's story hits different than you expected, and subscribe for more breakdowns that go deeper than the headlines.